First of all, I want a warm welcome to our colleagues from the city of Hagerstown. Welcome. We're looking forward to your visit. Mayor, would you like to begin?
Sure. First off, just a thank you for giving us time today on these joint items that we want to discuss. The first one being the vacant, abandoned, cyclical tax sale properties that we have in the city of Hagerstown, all over what you guys have them in Washington County also. Those repeat offenders who continue to go back to the tax sale and no one buys, and then they just sit there vacant and degrading, month by month. Actually, Jonathan Kearns and Paul Falk are here to fill us in on some information that will help us, hopefully lead us to a resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Put together a PowerPoint presentation today to discuss the vacant abandoned tax sale property problem that we've been seeing growing for a number of years now in the city, and it also impacts the county as well. So I'd like to go through the PowerPoint presentation and discuss maybe a potential partnership opportunity between the city and county to help us to alleviate the problem with these vacant abandoned tax sale properties. So each year, properties go to tax sale through the county treasurer's process. We have numerous properties that are vacant and abandoned that get stuck in this process. This happens when some properties just receive no bids during the tax sale process each June. Some properties actually receive bids, and then the tax sale bidders have up to 2 years to redeem those properties through a foreclosure process. Oftentimes with some of these properties that are in very poor condition, no foreclosure occurs. So it then results into a cycle of these properties going in and out of tax sale year after year. I think we have some properties that date back into the early 2000s that have been stuck in this process. And as you can imagine, conditions continue to get worse and worse every year. Tax lien amounts continue to grow. And what causes this phenomenon, as I'd mentioned before, some of these properties, they have tax lien amounts that far exceed the value of the property, or the tax lien amounts just do not make any type of redevelopment feasible if someone actually has to pay off those tax lien amounts, and then considering the amount of investment that would have to go into those properties for rehabilitation. Many of the properties are very deteriorated. Some of the properties are properties where the city intervened with code enforcement action. Paul can touch on that. We have properties sometimes that require demolition or intervention from the city from a safety perspective. So you have large amounts of tax liens that then get put on these properties after a demolition. Taxes and interest start to accrue, and you'll see some examples here later on the slideshow. You have tax lien amounts up to $100,000 on some of these properties. And I think the realization is we're never going to see any type of movement through the tax sale process because no one's willing to commit that level of funding for one of these properties. So what are these tax sale properties doing to our communities? They're suppressing property values, attracting illicit activity, definitely causing neighborhood blight, increasing demand from our police, fire, code administration staff, certainly even EMS services at times, and we're just continuing to lose that tax revenue for those properties. Pie chart I have here, what we're looking at is a representation of 41 city parcels that went through the tax sale process this June that received no bid. There were about 10 additional parcels that received no bid that were in the city of Hagerstown. I didn't consider them significant parcels because the tax amounts from the city perspective was about $1,000 or less. The 41 here had significant tax liens from the city of Hagerstown, ranging from $5,000 to upwards of $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. Of the 41 no-bid parcels in this pie chart, you have roughly $1 million of city taxes that are delinquent. Washington County taxes would be about $99,000, and then a very small portion of state taxes delinquent also at $13,000. And then just another glance at the no-bid parcels, the average tax delinquency amount is $25,000 for city taxes, $2,000, roughly $2,000 for Washington County, and about $327,000 for state. And maybe hard to see just the legend in the format here. That's a representation of where these properties are located in the city of Hagerstown. We have different categories of properties on this map. We have some properties that are vacant residential structures, some properties that are vacant residential structures that are in need of demolition, vacant lots that could be eligible for new construction, and then there are certain vacant lots that there's building restrictions or zoning restrictions where they would not even be eligible for any type of building purpose. And there's a county map showing some of the other parcels that are located sporadically through the county. I think there's approximately 18 county parcels that were on the no bid list, not necessarily in the same category as some of the problem city properties, but just being aware that there are some county parcels that are also in this no bid process. So just a few example properties. These are, I would categorize as some of our worst offenders in this cyclical tax sale problem. This is 661, 663 Pennsylvania Avenue. It's been in the tax sale cycle since 2016. As you can see, the property's in very poor condition. $75,000 of city taxes in arrears, $3,600 of county taxes in arrears, and almost $500 of state taxes in arrears.
I guess I'm having trouble understanding 75,000 since 2016.
Yeah, it's possibly been longer than that. Some of the dates that I have go back to some of the information. We've worked with Todd Hershey on these properties, and quite frankly, sometimes the interest can accrue very quickly when there's abatement actions. So some of these may actually date back further, but I used the chart I had received from.
And then the county is $3,606. I don't understand the.
I think that would just be, one, it starts with general property taxes and the tax differential, but most of these have city code enforcement actions that have required
I
city
was gonna say,
abatements
do
and
they-
tax liens.
Does
So
this prices include, I mean, does this
Mowing,
include fees? and
snow
fines and
removal,
things like that?
yes.
Okay.
So you'll see a lot of these where city code enforcement staff have taken some type of an action to mow grass, clean up trash and debris, board the property up, keep it secure. Those go in as tax liens, and then that's why you really see a spike in some of the city amounts.
I think a good comparison may be, or a good example, is obviously these all don't just exist in the city. There's one, if you travel up and down Virginia Avenue, about 5 blocks down from my house, which is outside of the city, that is adjacent to the Sheets that closed. I'm sure everybody's seen it. It was in the newspaper a couple of months back. Everybody's complained about it. It sits there vacant. All the windows are out. Some guy in West Virginia, I believe, has some type of ownership of it. And the difference there is nothing has been done about that particular property as opposed to these types of properties that are in the city, which we actively attempt to administer the codes to.
And at least secure. So that's for sure. I mean, we have, I know this property, I've been around it probably 4 or 5 times. Called one time, the back door at 663 had been kicked in, and our guys had to come over and secure it.
And I think Todd Hershey could confirm, I think an example with this property is that it did receive a bidder at one point, I believe, and the tax sale bidder purchases a tax sale certificate, then does not follow through with the foreclosure, so it's stuck in that process for 2 years, and then eventually comes back into the tax sale cycle. So just a few other properties, examples. Another problem property, 10 to 12 Elizabeth Street, $43,000 of city taxes, $4,200 of county taxes, $574 of state taxes. This is just an example. This is one where we would classify it just needs demolished. It's so far deteriorated and beyond repair. 339 North Jonathan Street. You'll see some of these tax amounts are a little more reasonable, but once again, they're not drawing any tax sale bidders. $5,800 of city taxes, $1,200 of county taxes, $176 of state taxes. 38 to 40 Charles Street, $17,000 of city taxes, $3,500 of county taxes, and almost $500 of state taxes. 600 North Mulberry Street, $11,000 of city taxes, $3,400 of county taxes, and almost $500 of state taxes. And then to finish with a few other different type of properties that are categorized as vacant lots that could be buildable or possibly not buildable. Here's a parcel that the city had intervened, I think, in the early 2000s to demolish an unsafe structure. $35,000 of city tax amounts and $1,600 of county tax amounts. This is a parcel that's not buildable. These are scenarios where it only seems like the reasonable solution would be to try to see if a neighboring property owner or adjoining property owner would maybe take the property for $1 or something like that to actually get it back on the tax rolls, have a property owner who's able to take care of it. Here's a vacant lot that's on Elizabeth Street, 15 to 17 Elizabeth Street, another demolition from the early 2000s, another very large amount of city taxes and some county taxes as well. So one of the things we've looked at is a program that would be modeled after a Dorchester County program. This process is and problem is not just a city of Hagerstown problem. It's been a problem somewhat statewide. There's actually been legislation in the previous General Assemblies to try to help provide local governments with solutions to this problem with cyclical tax sale properties. So we're looking at a conceptual program to enable redevelopment of these properties, get them repurposed, eliminating neighborhood blight, having some of the properties that maybe are feasible for rehab to be redeveloped, and maybe provide even housing opportunities through community partners. And what we would look to do through this concept is the city would basically go through tax sale foreclosure and become the owner of the properties. The goal would be to vet developers or maybe nonprofit organizations on the front end. So there would likely be a RFP process to seek a development partner for select properties. And we would go through that process and find a partner. And then at that point, we would enter into a tax sale foreclosure for said property with maybe some type of agreement with that partner. And then eventually sell that property after the city would go through the tax sale foreclosure, become the owner, then try to immediately flip it to that partner. And I think the realization is we're never going to be able to recoup those tax amounts. And this is similar to the Dorchester County model. I think they have a model where they are trying to recoup a certain amount of funding, but the contact I had spoken with there, Cindy Smith, who's the manager of their program to repurpose their problem tax sale properties, a lot of times they're selling these properties for $1 or for giving tax lien amounts to something more reasonable, so it makes development more feasible. So once again, in order to get these properties back into some type of productive, useful ownership, the city would incur legal fees to enter into tax sale foreclosure. We'd work with our city attorneys on that process. Once again, recognize that it would be very difficult to recuperate some of this funding. We would see if the county would be willing to partner, and especially in the beginning scenario, I think our goal was to begin this project on a pilot basis, maybe look at 2 or 3 properties, because this is unknown, this is new for us, and it's Dorchester County has their own model. It's a little different where they're the actual county, they're the entity that oversees the tax sale process. We're not that entity here, but we recognize these are city parcels. It wouldn't make sense for the county to intervene and foreclose on city parcels. So that would be where we would step in to take care of that process. And then maybe we're looking for the county commissioners to agree to maybe a conceptual way to help reduce some of those county taxes on those properties as we go through a tax sale foreclosure process to get it back into the private sector's hands.
Yeah, I did have a couple questions. I know a little bit about, I'm a foreclosure agent for Freddie Mac. How accurate, I mean, are we sure that, like I have a blighted property that it's probably, we just paid a $500 fee for blighted. I don't own it, I mean, it's through the bank.
Sure.
Is all the banks and all these out of the picture at this point?
Good question. I thought that may come up. Most of the time, unless there's maybe some unique circumstance, most of the time there is no mortgage holder or bank involved. Usually you would see properties in that scenario go through some type of foreclosure process with the bank. But
Yeah,
yes.
the one I'm talking about is Washington Street. We paid a $500 blighted fee, does that sound right?
Maybe vacant structure.
Yeah, that's correct. That's the vacant structure registration.
But it's under contract, so that's one off your list. But
Once it's sold, yes.
it takes the reason I ask, it takes an enormous long time to foreclose on a property. I've seen them said 3 or 4 years, and that's probably what you got going on.
We're not aware of bank foreclosures in some of those, especially some of the ones where the owners are deceased or
Right.
the ones that maybe date back to the early 2000s. Of course, we would work with our attorneys to make sure that title searches.
And they would have probably bought them back at auction.
Correct.
Yeah, probably. I would be, me personally, I don't know what we can work out, but you got to get rid of them, one way or the other. And I sort of like that one model. Freddie Mac's thing is go in, fix them up, get rid of them, and try not to destroy the neighborhood as bad. Make them conform to the neighborhood. And I think that's pretty much what you just said. Make them, tear them down when they can't be conformed. Some of these, they're beyond hope, but
Correct.
there's some investors might buy if they could partner with somebody and try to make them. I don't know what the answer is. I know if you got that many blighted properties, which I thought you might, something there's got to be a plan here somewhere to get them out of the city and the county.
I think that
I
was
think
how
the big ask from the count, or from the city for the county is for you guys to forego your
Right.
tax lien.
Yeah, yes. How about water and sewer?
You're
I
never
mean,
gonna see that money, so.
you guys got to be backed up on water and sewer
Some of-
fees,
Some of those don't have water and sewer accounts active
but I
anymore.
bet they got bills.
Maybe some outstanding, but a lot of times those meters were removed years ago, so they don't even exist anymore.
I was going to say the ones I run into have sometimes $4,000 or $5,000. How they get the county, whoever lets them get that high, I have no idea. $4,000 or $5,000 outstanding dollars worth of water and sewer bills. I was wondering if that has to be absorbed somewhere.
likely, if there would be any outstanding bills. I think that's our mindset, we need to intervene at this time. It's not working due to those factors keeping those properties in that process. And we're recognizing that we're never going to see those tax amounts again on those properties without some type of program to get them back into productive use.
Commissioner Wagner, about 9 years ago, we started a program on the water side to where if a property showed no meter activity over a 2-month period, we would shut the water off. We would
good
go out and
idea.
see if it was vacant. If it was vacant, we'd remove the meter. And until that property changed hands somehow or whatever, some of these parcels, I know Pennsylvania Avenue, the one he showed, it said 2016. I can go back probably as far as when I started doing it, 2007, that taxes haven't been paid. There hasn't been water there in at least that long.
When the water's shut off, do they still get a,
Not inside the city, no.
okay.
But for the period of time, it takes an average in the state of Maryland, I think it's 575 days for foreclosure to go from start to finish, which is about 3 times as long as our neighboring states, simply because of how we address the foreclosure process when the housing bust hit. In that time frame, the reason you see the water and sewer bills go so high is because 2 things happen. One is the owner walks away, the owner being the person that's sort of in debt to the bank that actually owns it. And the second is the bank says, look, we don't actually own it, that's the owner's problem. And so we as a utility entity, just like the county, will send that owner that has vacated the property or been foreclosed on or kicked out for non-payment, we keep sending them the bill. So every quarter they get the $300 bill, which is sort of like salt in the wound because they could be a year and a half gone, 2 years gone, and they're still getting a bill for a property they haven't lived in 2 years. And the bank says, look, we're not the deed owner. We're not responsible for this bill. So send that to Mr. Smith, who we've removed for non-payment. He's supposed to be paying that bill. And so that's the crux that utility gets into. What staff is able to provide us, and they did a couple years back, is a list like this one. And you can see there's about 100 properties on this list. It's about 8 pages, so there's about 800 properties we could identify that are either vacant or blighted or both at this point, and then a significant number of those that fall into this framework. One of the things that I did with staff about a year ago is sat down and had a conversation on 2 issues. One is, as you probably are all aware, we have a significant number of folks and families living long-term in hotels in this county. It's just a fact. It's happening. They pay on average about $1,400 to $1,600 a month to live in those hotels. That's what they pay. Cash up front, no protections. That's how it works. We have a housing authority, unlike city and county government, and housing authority is just an example here, that have access to state and federal resources that we just don't for housing rehabilitation purposes. And so what we looked at was a number of properties that we owned in the city that have not been sold since we took them in the home ownership rehabilitation program. I think there were 3.
4 total units.
So there were 4. So we were able to basically transfer those over then to the housing authority, who's an entity that then has access to funds to fix them up, to then provide opportunity. And I had the city and the housing authority folks, and frankly, folks from the Board of Education, homeless monitoring program, get them in contact with some of the families that live in these situations and see if they can be the end users and end owners of these places that the housing authority is able to fix up. And so there's an opportunity when we look at these number of properties and say, okay, well, if the city's not going to take that responsibility to carry that gamble and the county's not, I think that just gives you an example that there are entities out there that do have those capabilities and those access to financial resources to do so. And I think it provides, at the end of the day, an example of how you can actually affect positive change from the folks that are living in these hotels, because the bottom line is there's a number of hotels where you have bus stops too and things like that, that are affecting then your other governmental resources that they come to depend on.
What's the council's position on these? What do you all hope to do with them? I know you want to get them back on the tax rolls, but have you all come up with an idea or a suggestion or a plan among yourselves as to how you want to?
I think you suggested maybe an initial pilot.
Yeah, our next steps is to actually formally approve a program and get it rolling this fall. And the goal was to look at 2 or 3 of those problem properties and start this on a pilot basis.
I pulled up on SStat here a few of the properties that you mentioned in your slide, and I was kind of surprised to see that they're still in the homeowners' names. What does it require for you to be able to, I guess, foreclose and take possession of the property? Legislation and ordinance? Can you do it now if you had to?
I think there's been some legislation through the Maryland General Assembly that has given local governments, I think, a more efficient way of foreclosing on these properties in this tax sale cycle. The city of Baltimore was always afforded a lot more flexibility, and I think the state laws with dealing with these problems. And over the last 2 years, there's been different legislation that's now been approved with the state that's helping local governments combat this issue. So we would likely, just as a tax sale bidder would off the street at the tax sale, could go through a tax sale foreclosure process working with our city attorney. And what I think I had noticed in the last round of legislation is they're trying to make that process much more efficient for local governments to go through to make it a quicker process.
And a question maybe for our attorney or Mr. Hershey, is there a statute of limitations on taxes, property taxes?
Not to my knowledge. We have never written off real estate property taxes. That's why we're here today. We collect everything unless the properties are in bankruptcy or in this perpetual tax sale process. So we don't write off property taxes. We've never done that in the past. To my knowledge, there's no statute of limitations, and that's why we have these receivables that are out there for 10 and 12 years.
So if we did write off the property taxes, would the homeowner get a 1099-C, a cancellation of debt, and they have to claim that as income on their taxes, like a credit card or a mortgage loan?
We wouldn't get involved in that. We would go through the tax sale foreclosure process, by the way, which can be done in 9 months, best case scenario. So we have our tax sale in the first week in June of every year. You can actually file the action in circuit court in November, 6 months after the date of the certificate of sale. And you can file that action in circuit court 6 months after the date of sale, and then theoretically get it through circuit court in perhaps 3 months. And so it can be much quicker than a...
Right. Well, with us doing it, but if there was 3 banks involved, it probably took 3 years. But another suggestion, maybe our taxes are going, you can see, let's just take Pennsylvania Avenue, for example. You got a lot of back taxes there, city 75,000, but you tell me if I'm on base here, Todd, but it's assessed at 145, so that's going to create a higher tax base when they're going to accumulate. It's probably a $40,000 property at this point. So is there a way we can reassess and then it'll stop the pain a little bit till we get all these done? Because it might take years.
That's true. I mean, we could look at the assessed values. I mean, look at the assessed values. In relation to the total liens outstanding. And so the higher assessment valuation may get you a bid where you...
Yeah. But the people buy them are pretty smart.
I don't know that.
Yeah.
A lot of them, I'd like local people to participate in the annual tax sale.
Right.
I've worked on that very hard, but for the most part, we have 4 or so players out of the region, not in Washington County, who bid on most of these properties at tax.
I guess my only point was at $145,000 when you've got a property, if it's not a tear down, worth 40. I mean, Washington Street's going to be in the 40s. It's a duplex. We're just keep making that number go up, 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 up.
That's true. The reality of the amount
makes
of
no
county
difference if
taxes
we're
are
not gonna
probably
get it
not,
anyway.
and they're probably not, county taxes that you see on the screen are not in line with probably where the fair market value is in relation and reflective of the tax.
I think one other thing to note is, once again, once we enter into a potential process to get these properties sold through a program like we're looking at, like Dorchester County, some of those properties that do look like they could have a feasible rehab option. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have every property just given away for $1. I mean, we could model the process similar to our city's competitive negotiated sale program, where we're selling properties like the Massey property, the Pioneer Hook and Ladder building, the Roslyn building. So, for instance, we have sold some of those properties for very low cost, like the Pioneer Hook and Ladder building. We sold to Scott Bowen for $1, who's now moved his architectural office there. But we sold the Massey property, I think, for around $30,000 to Lloyd Thoburn. We sold the Roslyn building for about $250,000 to WLR Investment. So I think through the program, we would try to assess properties that would have some potential value. So it wouldn't necessarily be every case where all properties are receiving zero tax dollars, maybe through this process. It would be a case-by-case basis.
Just have a real quick question on the bottom. Well, part of this says, previous owner of record remains liable for uncollected tax amounts and judgments is entered for any remaining delinquent taxes.
Yes, that is a new part that comes from state legislation that I believe was passed in 2018. We can work with our attorneys in this process to enter a judgment to have that owner of record still be liable. It's not likely that we would ever obtain that, but it's still a step and a tool we could try to.
And that was my question: are in this, because we've heard canceling the debt, but in this scenario, we're not canceling their debt. We're changing the debt from, this is a tax sale to now we've got a judgment against you.
Removing it from the property to still keeping the person liable. Some scenarios, there's a few of those. I think the property owner may be deceased, which would be.
Yeah, we're not going to get.
But yes, the state legislation clearly had a new item that gives local jurisdictions that tool to still keep that owner liable for that debt.
My only concern, I think this is a great program, something we should definitely work towards. But my only concern is I want to make sure that an individual that we've removed a tax lien or property, is not going back through a different way to get that property acquired again. And just save themselves $75,000 in taxes, through two sales or a company buying it or something like that.
And that's why we're looking at a model like Dorchester County. It's one of the only programs like this in the state at this time. That's the purpose of the city's role in foreclosure and acquisition. So once the city would go through that foreclosure and acquisition process, we're in essence forgiving the liens through that process, versus we've had maybe people question, why don't you just wipe the tax liens clean and let them go back through tax sale, maybe opening the door to the scenario that you just brought up, and or having them just stuck in the process again with somebody that's a tax sale bidder, not really looking to redevelop it, but just trying to maybe gain funding from interest at the tax sale process. So yes, that's the goal of city acquisition and ownership, and then vetting a new owner.
So basically what you're asking us is work with you on a 1-by-1 basis or a 3-by-3 basis and modify our county taxes. Is that basically what this is all about?
Correct.
You do this through a pilot program with 2 to 3 homes.
Yeah.
Now, is this something that the city would enter a lien judgment against it, and then the county would also do the same thing at the same time, or could, for the county taxes?
Those would probably be details we'd work out with our attorneys. So there's still a lot of unknowns at this point, but yeah, that's a note we can make and find an answer.
Commissioners, what I'm hearing is some cooperation with this program. Start off with a pilot project. Is that what I'm?
I think it would be good. One thing I would personally like to see is whoever the end buyer is, whether it's an individual, the housing authority, a developer, they're given some kind of timeline. Part of the reason you want to, take care of the situation is because of the blight. You want to make sure that they're given a period of time to do something with the property if they're going to get maybe some kind of a deal out of it.
On this?
Yeah, ironically, that's one of the discussions. Scott and the staff and I would talked about that, and perhaps this is just one idea, as a bond or something that says the property is not going to just sit there. If all the debt's been relieved off it, the property isn't going to just sit there. A neighbor might get a fancy to think, well, it's up for auction, it's really cheap, I'll fix it. They may not be able to, then it sits there again. So we would want to work with, as you've said, both attorneys' offices and with Kirk to be sure that we're protecting against that.
And my guess is part of these have been investors who bought them and couldn't do anything with them.
Exactly.
And that's probably how most of them generated, a lot of them anyway.
Even with the best of intentions, they didn't have the resources to finish it off.
In the event of a vacant lot, which we have probably 15 or so vacant lots on that list, you wouldn't necessarily have to put an improvement on that lot. You could just as far as upkeep, making it part of your parcel to keep us from having to go out and abate it every week and a half for trash, grass, debris, that kind of thing.
I wouldn't require them to build a house on it right away.
But one thing that hasn't been said so far is economic development. We're both teaming together extraordinarily well on economic development, and we drive a prospect through and they see a blighted property like this, and they know what that means, everything that you've just said, illicit activity, all that type of thing. So the more we can do to help work with the city to improve that, the more it is for economic development as well. So there could be a win-win situation.
We'll just have our staff and attorneys work with Kurt and your staff and put together a pilot program and come back and get your blessing when we have the steps outlined.
I would agree with that, Commissioners. You like that suggestion?
Yeah.
And I think the pilot program, should set up, of course, a number of homes. So it says, we're going to do the five homes or properties and then continue with another 5 or whatever that number is, and not just say we're doing a pilot program.
So I'd like to see
Specific.
a win during these next 18 months or whatever, so that we can say this program works and
Then open it
needs to
up.
be continued.
Yep.
Okay, that's some direction for both teams.
Make it fun for the purchaser to come in and renovate a property, keep as much of red tape out of it as possible. Make it exciting for them.
about the
They
government.
don't want to hit a roadblock every time they go from one room to the other. Keep it fun and simple.
Okay, there we go. Nice presentation. Thank
What kind of a timeline do you think we'd be looking at?
I think our goal would be to get a program started this fall, and then, once again, looking at a different number of properties where we had talked about looking at maybe a vacant lot that really has nothing to do with it. We can get that maybe transferred to an adjacent property owner, looking at a property that needs rehabilitated, maybe a nonprofit such as the Housing Authorities, a nonprofit arm, or Habitat for Humanity. Maybe we can get one of those properties shifted, and then maybe a property that needs demolished. That would be working with the mayor and council on how they would want to handle it. But I think some of the properties that need demolished, we'd want to just demolish them if the city owns it. We have some funding resources through Community Development Block Grant, or our code budget has general funds for demolition. So maybe looking at a few different categories of properties in this cycle, approximately 3, and getting them moved through the first round, which would be the pilot process, and then reassessing where we're at from there.
We can start that process now, because the results of the last tax sale, we had 70 properties we couldn't get a bid on. Those certificates could default to the Washington County Commissioners because there are no bids.
So you're actually the holder of the certificate of sale at this point. And so what the commissioners would simply, city decides on what parcels they want to consider. We would look at the tax abatement amount and send them to you for your approval to transfer the certificate of sale over to the city of Hagerstown to foreclose. So we can start now.
Okay. Good.
We don't have to wait for next year's tax sale.
very good. All right, there's some direction. Thank you
Thank you very much.
very much.
And
All right,
thanks, I'm sorry, Mayor, thanks to Todd. Todd and I started working on this, about 8 years ago? And only through the legislation of the last couple of years has it really made it much more easier to be able to do this. So Todd's been great to work with through all this.
I like
Red tape,
hearing that he says he collects money. Very much.
You ready to move on there, Mr. President?
Yes, Mayor, please
Okay.
continue.
Annual payment of Consolidated Communications Center. We got presenting this.
Okay, so we're here today to discuss the $406,000 annual payment that the city has been forwarding to the Board of County Commissioners relative to the consolidation of the 911 center that began back in 2009 and then was actionized July 1, 2009. And my understanding is that payment has been made consecutively for the last 10 years, the most recent being made 1 to 2 months ago. The discussions that we've gone through, we've went back through our records, tried to find evidence of the payment, what instituted and triggered the payment, what the calculations were brought from, and it was meant to be 85% of the cost of 11 employees that transferred from city employment back in 2009 to county employment when the county took over the dispatching services for the Hagerstown Police Department specifically. The Consolidated Center provides all of the dispatching services for fire, police, and EMS for the entire county, and we answer all 911 calls for all agencies with the exception, we answer all 911 phone calls for all law enforcement, fire, and EMS as well. We do not provide the dispatching service for the Maryland State Police. They provide that from a small dispatch center that's out on off Sharpsburg Pike. The summary of employees, there were 11 that came over. Currently, there are still 4 existing city employees that transferred that work for the center. The rest have either retired or retired out for medical, or in some cases transferred to additional positions. What we've worked out to give you a representation of what those costs would look like today if the same agreement carried forward, there would be the original 4, and then there would be an additional 7 positions at an entry-level salary of $40,551. Those salaries collectively would represent about $545,827.80. 85% of that in today's dollar would be about $463,953.63. Monday, in talking to Kevin Lewis, who was the director in my position back when the consolidation came forward, he was able to find a document, and I think that's been shared from the Hagerstown Police Department. It was authored from then Chief Art Smith to then City Administrator Bruce Zimmerman. And in there is a clause that clearly states the cost-sharing agreement between the city and county remains unchanged, as do other HR recommendations. And to restate the cost-sharing formula, the city will pay the county an annual sum of 85% of the salary of 11 city employees on their last day of city employment. The method and schedule of payment will be worked out between city and county officials. The sum will remain unchanged in future years, even though some of those employees retire or otherwise leave employment. This is deemed appropriate as the city will continue to receive the same level of service regardless of who performs the functions of police dispatch. So that's the records that we have. I don't know if the city has anything different. I did speak to Charlie Summers, who has recently retired as the Assistant Director of Emergency Services here, but at the time of the consolidation had recently retired from the Hagerstown Police Department as the operations captain. And he actually, I have an email from him that this is exactly how the agreement was intended to be structured. In his words, it's in perpetuity. It was not intended to stop.
Question for you, Dave. Of the 4 remaining employees there currently, what is that total salary cost?
That is $261,970.80.
Do you know of any other municipal jurisdiction that pays the county for its 911 service?
I do not know of any. I can't answer that, to be honest. We've not gone through that regimen. I can tell you in Washington County, we don't have any other municipality that does, but we also don't have any other municipality where we dedicate 2 full-time dispatchers 7 days a week, 24 hours a day to the city police department. And in this case, we do. So if you look at the makeup of the center, we have 2 HPD dispatchers on all the time. We have 2 sheriff's department dispatchers on all the time, 2 fire rescue dispatchers, 2 call takers, and 2 supervisors. The supervisors come back and actually fill in at whatever location that the surge might be at that moment. And then we have a power shift that works certain hours, and that puts us at 11 positions. But that typically starts as a call taker.
Dave, are we adequately covered, or are we going to have to be hiring more people here? Because if we have to hire more people, that's more money.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that without question, as you take on more calls for service increase, as time goes on, there becomes a time where we have to reevaluate what the appropriate level of staffing is. We've gone through and we went to the 12-hour shifts back in 2017, And with the restructuring, the shifts, that allowed us to have our full-time staff work more hours, not necessarily through overtime, but they work a 42-hour work week instead of a 40-hour work week. Their wages were increased relative to compensate for that additional hour contribution, but that allowed us to change our daily staffing levels. And during the daytime, we look to staff 11, and then on the evening overnights, our minimum staffing can drop back to 9.
Well, what I'm getting at is our costs seem to be increasing dramatically if we staff it properly, the dispatch. And if our costs, to cover the county to get in our training, that worries me a little bit if our cost is extremely going up and we're short people and how much overtime do we pay a year? Do we 400,000, 300? Do you have any idea?
I'm not sure I brought that one with me. I had that, but I don't know that I brought that with me today. I don't have that with me.
If memory serves, I think you're quite accurate, right between 300,000 and 400,000.
So if we're paying 300,000 and 400,000, still maybe have to hire and train people. I guess that's what bothers me.
We certainly have the obligation to continue to maintain adequate staffing, and again, I'm relaying some of the conversations that Director Summers shared with me, both past and as recently as last evening, is the city began to experience cost savings day one because they were able to move out of supporting a radio system, a communication center that didn't need to exist anymore, the cost of wages as they increased throughout the years, the extra contributions to retirement and all those things. And again, I wasn't here at that point, so I'm bringing some of this third party, but that's the conversations that have been shared with me and what we've been able to produce as far as documentation. And again, the contribution's $405,630, and that's been annually since 2010. And I think for me, the question isn't as much as was it meant to continue, is maybe more as should it continue. And I think the fact that it's been paid for 10 years, for the most part, leaves enough understanding that it was meant to be ongoing. It wasn't a one and done or 1 or 2 year type of deal. So.
Council, anybody?
I have a question. When you say there's how many personnel that are on call?
Each day?
Yeah, during a shift.
10 is the average where we try to be.
You say 2 of those are dedicated?
The HPD, 2 to Sheriff's Department, 2 to Fire EMS, 2 call takers, 2 supervisors.
Is 2 commensurate with the number that the city would have had on call during the time in which it conducted its own process?
I'm going to have to, I believe the communications supervisor at that time, Tom Brown, is now our assistant director, is in the audience. I'd have to throw that question back to him.
Tom, would you come down front and join, please?
Sure. I understand that there are 2 that are dedicated to HPD. I was just curious if 2 would have been a number that was commensurate with the staffing level that the city would have utilized when it had its own process.
That's correct. We were working, at the time, we were working 2 dispatchers at a time. The only time that we worked any higher numbers than that was on a Saturday, because nobody got Saturdays off, because we were on 5-day permanent shifts with 8-hour shifts with 2 days off, 2 permanent days off.
So that was the 11. In other words, that's what the 11 individuals did. They did those 2 on.
Yes.
And that did not include any staff above the 2 call takers, correct? So there was nobody on except for those 2 individuals.
That's correct, except for on Saturdays.
Right, but nobody oversaw them that also transferred as part of this process.
Was there a supervisor?
There's a supervisor, right, there were 10 plus a supervisor that transferred over at the time.
So the supervisor.
Which was myself.
But But the supervisor was there in addition to the 2 call takers, right?
The supervisor worked daily, Monday through Friday.
Okay.
Commissioners, any more comments? Mayor?
Just a quick question I have. I'm reading the letter that we were just given here. Was any consideration given by the city to the county for the reason we consolidated obviously was for efficiency, cost of equipment that the dispatchers would be using, ongoing training that they might need, things like that, like not just salaries, but there's an efficiency created through the equipment and the housing of those employees.
Again, going back to the conversations with Director Summers, these were all things that prove value for the city, and one of the reasons, probably of a multitude of reasons why it made sense to consolidate on both agencies' part, not just, this isn't a one-way street for the city either, but I think all of those things have to be considered, that when you talk about efficiencies, one center, even though one might have been bigger than the other, the cost of equipment doesn't have to be duplicated. If there is supervision, the supervision doesn't have to be duplicated. Training, certainly that comes across to the county side of things. And it's not a new conversation to this board that we continue to hire dispatchers, call takers, because of turnover, retirement, and those types of things. And it costs us a fair amount of money each time we have to replace that person. So all of that, I would advocate that the county's absorbing those costs. And again, all of the software upgrades, our annual software upgrade for just the CAD system for dispatching is well north of $150,000 a year.
Dave, is the 911 center funded through the general fund for the county?
Yes.
Yes.
So city taxpayers actually pay into the general fund for the county. That helps support the 911 center. That's a yes.
Yeah,
That was,
yes.
I'm sorry, that was rhetorical. Again, and I'm not going to beleaguer the point that I'm going to make one more time, is that we have tried to find out. There is no, out of 157 municipalities in the state of Maryland, there was one that pays directly to the 911 center of that county, the city of Hagerstown. Nobody else does. So when you talk about Anne Arundel County and the city of Annapolis and all those things, no one else does. Now, again, I'm not here to, I was part of this consolidation back then, and it was a good thing for the city of Hagerstown, as you pointed out. Freed up space for us, things like that, took over some of our personnel, helped us there. I mean, it was a good thing in 2009. I have to tell you that my recollections from 2009, I know I'm getting older, but it was still only 10 years ago, I never in my mind thought it was going to be in perpetuity. I figured at some point in time our costs would decrease as we lost personnel, our city personnel that we transferred over. That's how I recall it from thinking about it from 10 years ago. Although no one ever actually came out and said that. I want you to know that. But that was, just made sense to me that we're transferring people. We're going to pay for those people until we don't have those people anymore. And then that would be the end of it, of the city's obligation toward this. We can't seem to find an agreement anywhere.
And likewise, I don't know that we have one either, Mayor. We just literally, Director Lewis had this on a personal drive of his, and I asked him to go back again and look, and he went back and looked in the projects folder, which is where the consolidation resided for him, and I immediately made this letter available, and I shared it with the fire chief to make sure that we weren't trying to come in here blindside anybody. My only point with the letter was really to go down the conversation I've shared with county staff and with anybody else is, in what I've heard in my 3.5 years here, both from Director Summers and now at least through a correspondence less than 4 months before the actual consolidation occurred, that the intent was it was to be ongoing. And it's what I'd said earlier. To me, and I'm just being honest, the question isn't as much about whether it was meant to be forever. It's today's question is, should it continue forever? And that's certainly beyond me to answer that, but
I don't think we'll have that answer today.
Well, we're sort of beating around the bush here, Mayor Bertucci. What are you proposing? $261,970.30?
Listen, I'm proposing whatever makes sense to the bodies. I actually don't have a proposal.
I think
I don't, but
think
I don't
the
know if my
difficulty
council
is-
does.
I think the difficulty is we have one document here. City staff provided us with two others, which I'm trying to find and I can't find them, that say something differently. So I have three documents in existence out of this entire process, neither of which say the same thing, both of which are either meeting minute reflected or staff memo reflected. There's no one has a document that says, here is specifically how this has to occur. What we've been provided today is a memo from city staff to city staff that speak to the metrics of it, and there's two other documents that Scott provided us a couple weeks ago that spoke differently than that. And so I think that it's incumbent upon us that if we're going, to come to some resolution, that we say, okay, what did the folks mean back then? Because we have different documents that say different things, and decide what that document's going to look like going forward. The other thing I'll say is I don't know that you can speak to this issue, at least from my perspective, in a vacuum, because we have at least one other agenda item here today that relates to public safety, fire and rescue services, that there is some continued disparity on. So I think that there's a bigger conversation there than just this specific item that we're referring to in this conversation.
I agree with Kristen there. That was my intention when I tabled this item originally, was to have everyone come to the table about the whole fire rescue picture, which I don't think we can talk about in a vacuum. I do agree there.
Right, and I totally agree. And I don't think this item is going to be answered today by anybody. I would suggest, since the city's already made their payment for this fiscal year, that we're not due again until July of next year. Maybe we have time between now and then when we talk about that, and because the next item is important also, the automatic mutual aid firefighting rescue and EMS agreement. So I believe that's important too, and I'm looking at the time and I'm wondering if we're going to get through that. And I think that's a conversation we should at least begin today also before we run.
Mayor, are you suggesting then we should work at some staff levels?
I believe we should.
A solution
I believe we
agreement,
should.
Since there's three different documents saying three different things. Commissioners,
Yeah, Kristen, you were county commissioner with me in 2009 when we supported all of this. And-
Correct.
And I can't remember all of the details. I can't remember that far back in total clarity. But I remember the city or someone presenting a perpetuity. The amount would be for, be in perpetuity. And it was also I remember the term honey of a deal. Now, I don't know if that came out of our commissioners meeting or if Mr. Murray had used that line. But at that time, this amount that was established was a really, really good deal for the city, and everybody was on board for perpetuity. And you and I both sat on that board, and I was just looking at.
Are you asking my recollection of those discussions?
No, I just said that you were on the board when we had those discussions.
Correct. Because I remember sitting in one meeting with the city and some staff from county at the Burhan's room, and the discussion at that time was the disparity that would immediately be created by frankly, the difference in benefits and protections that city employees enjoy from being in that city position in the city union, and the transfer that they would both lose some of those protections and frankly, if you go back and lose some of those benefits, a number of which were paid out sort of immediately in that transfer process, and how that dissolution over time would have to occur no differently than it does for other operations, such as when we consolidated, I think it was purchasing. at one time.
I will just say, as someone who was not involved in 2009 in this conversation, I don't know when an agreement would be made ever that would be made forever. I mean, I don't know of any other agreement this council has made that something is forever. Normally, things have a timeline on them, and with 3 conflicting documents, I think whether we pay it, we don't pay it, we all need to come up with some sort of agreement, because this issue, at this point, has no agreement, and that's a problem.
Must be an agreement, they pay.
Slocum, would you suggest staff be in a meeting with their colleagues to discuss this?
I mean, I know I would like to see the other documents that you guys have. I haven't seen those.
So that's the first thing. I wanted to ensure that we all parties have all 3 documents. The one that we have just found is the April 22, 2009 memo. And perhaps what we do first is exchange the documents we have to be sure we all have the same ones. We have gone through the meeting minutes in an attempt to locate some further discussion, as Commissioner Baker had referred to, or Councilman Ayrshire. We haven't found those to date. We will certainly look again, and then work with Scott's office to try to bring this to some type of resolution.
Staff has developed a timeline with information that Councilman Ayrshire was talking about. We can get this in your hands. Basically, it's a consolidated, what's minutes from a couple work sessions back in 2008, a consolidated business plan from you all, actually, from the commissioners back at that time, and then the actual motion back on May 26, 2009, where it just simply stipulated the department, the city's payment to the county of some 85% of the salary of the 11 city employees on their last day of city employment. It doesn't say that it, in perpetuity at that point, so we can get these to you.
Is that a plan that we'd like to move forward with? Meet?
I would suggest that we don't wait so long in between our joint meetings, that maybe we try to,
Begin at staff level immediately and be ready for another joint meeting?
yeah.
How's that for a plan?
You guys need to talk about the consolidated mutual aid agreement.
One final thought, though. I just want to make sure that we're not all going to try to figure out what was trying to be determined in 2009, that there's actually, like the director says, what do we do going forward, that we're not all going to try to interpret what 3 documents were supposed to mean. So I just want to make sure that that's not the goal of at the staff level to
Whatever
try
it
to
is, I know
determine.
to be fair and balanced. So
Thank you.
I've got to go.
What year did we do the tax differential or tax set-off, Kristen?
I believe that was in 2009,
Before or after this?
during the same time.
And I'm just wondering if this was taken into consideration when we did the tax set-off.
Not that I recall.
Yeah, I mean, that's something to look at, too.
All right, maybe move on to the next item. I think we've decided we're going to meet staff, not hesitate, get this before us, our next joint session or sooner. Okay? All right, next item, since the mayor has left, who is the commander?
What?
The next item with Chief Laura would be to discuss the automatic aid agreement between the city and the county.
So both bodies have been briefed on this document independently. I believe it was added to the agenda today to have the opportunity for the respective either commissioners or mayor and council to interact with each other. As we reported earlier to both bodies, we believe this is clearly in the best interest of the citizens, not only Hagerstown, but Washington County, by sending the closest resource, the opportunity to maximize credits with the Insurance Services Office's rating schedule program, which is a direct benefit to anybody that pays fire insurance in Washington County, and establishes legal boundaries for equitable level of in-kind services and who has responsibility for incident command in host jurisdictions. So without going through a briefing again that we actually exercised this morning. I think Director Hayes and I are here to entertain questions from either body and see if we can assist with that in the spirit of time.
And just to add just a short bit to that, for Mayor and Council's benefit more so, I've given this document to the leadership of the Volunteer Fire and Rescue Association. We've had a couple revisions, but we've provided that each, and I have extended to them till August 30th to provide written comment. And we do have one piece of language that the county attorney is communicating with the association's attorney that we might consider to add, but I do not believe it affects the structure and intent of the document in whole. But outside of that, that's really the timeline. Our intent is to get this from a draft to a final document after conversations by both groups here and taking into consideration anything that the association would have, and then get this back to the mayor and council and the board for subsequent execution, and we can kind of get a check mark and move on by it.
So I wanted to say a couple things that I'm not sure were touched on heavily enough that need some clarification. First, this is a proactive measure by the two gentlemen sitting here in uniform, working with Kirk's office and on the city side. Very much a proactive measure that I think should be applauded. As a citizen of the county or the city, I think I'd rather know that there is some type of mutual aid. You may benefit from some new language, but I think we need to applaud them for stepping up and trying to be proactive here for the benefit of both city and county residents. And the other thing is, from what I understand, without this, it already does largely function this way. This is simply for the insurance purposes, for other purposes, this is going into place as a proactive measure.
Right, and I think it really comes back into the conversation we just wrapped up. Without documents such as this that clearly articulate what our intent is, we get into discussions maybe 10 years later about what we really wanted to do. So again, we're doing 95% of this already. This just memorializes it, formalizes it, whatever word you want to use. But I don't know any business that wouldn't have a business plan that says what we're going to do when you have neighboring jurisdictions that have responsibilities within each of those boundaries. So, and we cross-pollinate, and we have to. We need each other, so we have to cross-pollinate.
But I would simply add that from both bodies, this document sets clear expectations for every fire rescue service provider about what the political expectations of the leadership are. Send the closest unit, hold each other harmless for day-to-day operations, et cetera, all of the things that we articulated. I mentioned this morning, public safety is a time and distance business. So to get some of these things institutionalized in writing, I think, if nothing else, sets the blueprint for how we should be delivering services to our citizens, not only today, but as far into the future as this document will carry us.
I mentioned this morning, the irregular boundaries bordering some of the other municipalities creates an issue on who's closest, does it not sometimes? So what you're saying is, we're not gonna worry about the boundaries. We wanna get services to those people immediately. We'll figure out the rest later.
Absolutely.
You're putting safety first is what I'm hearing.
But what we have recognized in this same document, taking that conversation forward, is we're going to send the closest unit, not relative to political boundaries, so to speak, but recognizing the political sovereignty of each. We're also going to send the unit that normally would go from that particular group as well. So if it's in the city of Hagerstown, you're going to get, if there's a county fire department closer, you're going to get it. But you're going to get your city engine too. Transversely, it's a two-way street. We're going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. So I said it this morning, it's a citizens first approach, and anything short of that would be a failure. And that's just how I see it, and I can speak for Steve. He's had enough of those conversations with me as well.
And I'm not sure we articulated it prior, but the original boundaries for fire rescue service delivery throughout the county were based on tax districts and had nothing to do with public safety. In fact, when I come into the business in '71, they were called District 10, District 6, District 4, and they were simply tax boundaries. So this is a huge step forward, really. Even though we are doing most of this now, it is subject to change if any individual company chooses to.
Something else I'd like to add too, just for clarity. We address this document at the highest level of government, meaning the county commissioners, the mayor and council. By statute, regulation, you are the authority having jurisdiction over all matters respectively. So this document is at those levels. You can call it however many foot off the ground you want. I use the 35,000 foot all the time. You know, our office, the association, the volunteer fire and rescue company, Steve's office, we're flying at that 20, 25,000 foot level. We're the ones that actually actionize, but you have to set the expectation. So the reason you're the signatories on the document is just that. You have the responsibility.
I'm going to say a couple things. The first is both these guys know, and I'm very familiar with both, that I have great respect for them. I think that they've brought this discussion light years ahead of where any of us that are in political office could ever get it, and have gotten it in the last 20 years. I just think that that's as close as I see it. That said, as I have expressed to the chief, I continue to be opposed to this document. Not because I think it's a bad document, but because I think it's a bad deal for the city, because the city has a paid fire service. And nowhere in this document, and I appreciate certainly that within the document it does indicate that our respective governmental bodies will be the deciding entities on how this document will actually work. I don't have great faith politically, frankly, that the county body will execute that upon the 26 independent, privately owned volunteer fire and rescue companies in this county. And without their acquiescence to the parameters of this agreement, I think all it really does is obligate the city's paid fire service to continue to extend into those areas that we already are, as they have said, like we're already doing.
You know, I have more faith in that than our fire and rescue services throughout the whole county, including Hagerstown, that they wouldn't risk a citizen's life because of politics or because of boundaries. You know, I don't agree with that. I mean, I respect it, but I don't agree with it. I just have a lot more faith in our rescue companies than that. You got two of the leaders sitting right there, and they have faith in it. If I don't have faith in it, it doesn't go anywhere. So anyway, that's all I got to say.
Right, this is just a draft. There'll be a second draft, and that will proceed to the association for review as well.
So they have the document, less the most recent change about the language we added at the end, and I can't articulate it, but it doesn't affect the material respect with the volunteer groups, but we'll get them that edit. And then again, if you're going to have dialogue with Mr. Poole, and we draft additional language. So I'd like to get that language in there first, and then get the document back to them. And obviously, we're sitting on top of the 30th, so if we don't get them the document until the 30th, you know, I'm going to have to open that timeline up some more for them, and we will do that out of respect and opportunity.
Just got a comment on that, so I'm sorry, this just kind of rubs me the wrong way. And I understand that you have got a paid fire staff, but how much does the city put towards EMS stations throughout?
Sure. First, I'll respond. Those services, by state statute, are a county responsibility.
Oh, I understand that, but what I'm sitting here saying is that this is a mutual aid. This is not a singular aid. This is EMS coming, you know, this is firefighter. And, you know, I was a rescue swimmer in the Navy, and I was an EMT in the Navy. And it didn't matter if it was a Navy call or a Navy ship. If somebody went down and wherever, we went out and saved them, because that was the first. The first thing was the safety of the individual. The second thing was to figure out, okay, now who gets paid? Okay, and that's where I'm looking at. And I think our fire and our EMS, they're going to respond no matter where. It doesn't matter. And to think that we're worrying about this. And I mean, I wasn't on the city council when they implemented a paid fire staff. We're sitting here as a county working towards hiring in the Safer Grant, hiring 29 firefighters and looking at the next step. We're looking at funding $2 million in 2 years towards the EMS. So while we're sitting here expanding, and then you're saying you're worried about having a mutual agreement for your paid fire staff, which already is coming out, to me, it's almost an insult.
Well, I would have no problem if you would go out and get the signature of either the association as a representation to the agreement or the individual signature of each of those 27 companies that says, yes, we will agree to abide by this agreement. If you did that, I'd be completely fine with the agreement.
I think they put on there that the Volunteer Fire and Rescue Association is going to come back with agreements by Friday, so that you're bringing in the Volunteer Fire Association into the agreement. And I actually made that comment this afternoon saying, should all of the individual companies be assigning this? And legally,
Which I agree with.
So legally, since we're over all of them, we're saying that you are required to do this.
And I hear that being said, but I will use the example of Fairplay, which was shut down for an extended period of time, in which those other independent companies had to pick up that process. And I don't have great faith in that being, a parameter of that solution if it would come to that, which is why my preference would be that both the governmental bodies as well as that organization as an entity or those individual entities would indicate support and approval for it prior to our signing it.
Don't I think that's what we're having on Friday? Is the Volunteer Association is
I
supposed
don't
to...
know that.
Well, that's what we're asking the report back by the 30th, and we're not signing it until we get all agreements. So I think it's already being addressed.
But to answer your question about how much the city contributes to fire and EMS in
I
the
just said
county,
EMS. I didn't say fire and I said just EMS.
I'm happy to provide this documentation I gave to the last Board of County Commissioners that indicates what parts and percentages of budgets of the municipalities in this county, as well as the county, go to those services in this county, which the county is obligated to provide. I'm happy to give that to you.
I'd love to see it.
I
Any
think
more
that conversation goes back to the conversation I thought that we were going to have today, and I understand there's time constraints and we'll have to do this again, but I think a lot of the frustration, first of all, as far as the MOU, I'm fine with it, but the fire rescue conversation, I think with funding and shared funding and the portion that the city volunteers get, and all of this is a big picture that we want to sit down and hash out, and that includes the 911 payment, includes this entire conversation. I would appreciate if the next time we had a joint meeting that we discuss the tax differential and the funding and that type of thing. So I think that's where a lot of the frustrations are up here.
Oh, I think the tax differential needs to be looked at a incremental time period. It definitely should not be a in perpetuity thing.
Right.
We need to set that up, that it's being looked at if it's every 10 years, that we're looking at that to make sure that it's still relevant and feasible.
Absolutely. But in fairness, we've been asking since the last administration, and I know staff has done work at that level, but I think it's time to get some numbers done.
I think you're both absolutely right. In fairness to the staff on both sides, we did come over to City Hall and did speak with them prior to Scott being here. So we've tried to convey, and actually we've spoken to Scott since he's arrived and had a very engaged discussion. So it is a complex matter, and I think with the new communication, we'll definitely be up to speed together for both political bodies.
Director Hayes, Chief Floor, you have your direction on what to do next? Absolutely. Council, any other questions? Commissioners? All right, Scott, would you like to introduce the next issue or concern?
The next issue wouldn't necessarily call it a concern, but the next topic
Issue?
would be, it's just a topic,
Topic?
just something to talk about.
I'll agree with that.
Would be a discussion on the medium range growth area and impacts on economic development between the city and the county. We have our city planner here, Kathy Marr. County planner, we've also had some pretty in-depth discussions between staff, I think 3 or 4 of them now, concerning the boundaries of the medium range growth area, economic development that is coming through, which, as Rob had stated, is probably at an all-time high, or at least a high, at least over the last decade or two, and what that does to the city as far as its allocations for water and wastewater, and for the county as far as your wastewater allocations. Just a recognition of the fact that staff have been in discussions. We have presented some text amendments to incorporate into the county comp plan along our that include our water and wastewater policy, and then also thoughts as we continue on to look at how we work together with economic development to identify the best uses or the best placement of potential investment as it relates to the ability to allocate appropriate water resources to those areas. So, Kathy, can you just provide, and Mr. Goodrich there, just provide an update of what we've discussed up to this point?
Yeah, please come forward and join us.
Yes, President Klein, Steve Goodrich, our director, is here as well, so they can both provide what information they have.
Good afternoon. Yes, we have had at least 2 joint staff meetings between city planning, city and county planning, economic development, and utility staff over this issue of the city's medium range boundary, which was devised as a boundary that we felt we could serve our utilities for with the projected growth for the life of our comprehensive plan. And we also have, in companionship with that, we have a water and wastewater policy, which is a list of exemptions that allow you to get city utilities outside that boundary under special circumstances. Not thinking that this would be a catch-all for anything that happens outside the MRGA, but special limited circumstances. Well, we've been getting a lot of interest beyond the MRGA for economic development, which is putting stress because they're not quite fitting into the water policy, or there's a feeling that there's too many of these, therefore maybe the boundary of the MRGA needs to be looked at. And so that's why we were having these meetings, because for the people who are between the MRGA and the county's urban growth area, which is a very large area devised in the county comp plan that's also in the county water and sewer plan, the people in the sort of no man's land get caught because the city is saying, we're not going to serve you unless you can get one of these exemptions. And the health department is saying, we won't let you have a well because you're in the larger UGA. And so people are being put in a tough spot. And so we're trying to figure out how can we make adjustments to our various policies so that it better reflects the economic development priorities of the county as well as priorities of the city, and takes into consideration the utility capacity limitations that the city has.
A couple of things I could add to that. Maybe this would be the time for me to ask the ladies in the PR booth to put up the map on the screen. There we go. It magically appears upon request. To illustrate the area that we're talking about on the map on the screen behind the commissioners, and also on the desk here for commissioners to view. The area that we're talking about are the various growth areas designated by the city's comprehensive plan and the county's comprehensive plan. On the map, you see the city of Hagerstown in the gray area. You see the city's medium range growth area in the blue, and then the county's urban growth area, which has the same intention as the city's boundary, is shown by the red line. And so those areas in between the blue and the red line are areas that the city, in its most recent comprehensive plan, which is 2018 or 19, they've made some very clear statements about their intention and their ability or not having the ability to provide public water service to those areas that are shown in white. And some of those areas are pretty important economic development areas that the county has included in its growth area. It's important for you to know that we are in the middle of the process of updating our comprehensive plan. And each time we do that, we certainly consider the city's plans, because we just can't act independently. So it's those areas that are in white on this map inside that red line that are really our bottom line concern, where public water isn't intended at the moment, and it may be difficult to get permission to drill individual wells to serve economic development projects. It may or may not. Some part of that is not really well known. We have already initiated, the city has already initiated, and we're processing an amendment to the county's water and sewer plan to incorporate the city's most recent growth area policies about providing public services. We have no problem with the proposed amendments. It's more what we're proposing to include is factual information and adopted policy. There's really no debate about whether it should or shouldn't be in the plan. It should be in the plan. But it's the effect of those statements that public water facilities aren't going to be available in certain areas. There's no debate about the city's policy on providing public water. City's public water is the only game in town, is in the growth area. They have the only system that's available, and of course the city has perfect right to decide where it's going to provide service, where it can and cannot provide service due to capacity. So that's maybe not in a nutshell what the issue that we're talking about. I think maybe I could jump ahead and say that because of time and because this issue is much bigger than what we've already described, our hope at the staff level, our hope is that you will give us the flexibility to continue to work at the staff level and dig as deep into this issue as we need to, and start to look for options to address the concern about not having water for certain economic development projects. And when we do identify solutions, of course, we would come back to commissioners and the mayor and council for approvals, adjustments, or whatever it takes to continue to be able to promote our growth areas for economic development. Have I said that correctly? That's our end result, our end hope for this particular discussion.
And what you need to recognize is that we do not have capacity to serve that red line. We don't even really have capacity to fully serve the blue area. So if we change the blue area, it's not going to get bigger, it's just going to shift. And so that's why staff needs to talk about priorities. Because there's about 2,500 acres of vacant commercially zoned land in the MRGA. If we're getting requests outside of the MRGA, leapfrogging over those areas, and the county needs to tell us, all right, that's not our priority anymore. Our priority is over here or whatever, because we have a finite area, and it just has to shift. And so that's why we need to have these conversations.
Yeah, I think the overriding concern is that if we're going to expand an area for economic development, and the ones we're being asked to expand into most recently and the greatest percentage are up in the north section there, just beyond the airport and up to the Pennsylvania state line. If we're going to continue to do that and continue to expand that way, and businesses that want to and concerns that want to put hotels and things up in that area don't have the option to drill a well because the state won't let them, then we need to shrink these other areas in. That red line, if we move the red line up that many acres, we need to reduce acreage someplace else so that we have the capacity. And that's the basic bottom line here.
We are right in the midst of updating our comprehensive plan, and part of that is a development capacity analysis that we are required to do to then look at that red boundary to decide if it should stay where it is, or if it should be expanded, or if it should be brought in. And one of the most difficult, one of our greatest concerns about adjusting that line, besides the development capacity analysis, is that our urban growth area boundary has been in place pretty much the way it shows on that map for at least 20 years. We've been through 2 iterations of a comprehensive plan. The growth area boundary has become more and more definitive over that time period. And so there's a certain expectation in the community that is the area that we want growth to take place. Things have changed dramatically since the early 80s when that boundary was first set. So I'm not saying it's untouchable by any means, but that is a large concern on the county side because of those expectations and other plans that have been put in motion to encourage development to take place in those areas. And again, this is something that we need to work on and dig down deep at a staff level to find solutions for. Maybe we will move the line. Maybe, I can't say for sure at this point.
I think we need to have a methodology, though. The methodology needs to say that for every acre we expand outside of our medium growth area, we need a reduction of some other space.
Steve and Kathy, was there some promise of actually the definition of available water service in some
In the
revision
state
of
law-
that definition that might help all of us here, both the city and the
laws and
county?
regulations that guide us when we create the water and sewer plan and the connection between the water and sewer plan and our comprehensive plans. The word available simply means it's there in the ground or it's under construction in the ground. So that's pretty clear. But there's more to available than just having that line in the ground. Is there capacity in the plant? Is there capacity in that line, even though there's a line in the
Isn't
ground?
that part of what the
So-
staff level discussions were, is to further define that and more clearly and hopefully fairly expeditiously define that so it may benefit not only both political bodies, but also the folks that are in that area, so that it's not, the comprehensive plan isn't saying there's water available there when in fact the health department says you can't drill because there's water available there. And I think our next meeting might get down to that, hopefully, where if there is some traction to be made, we can further define that.
There's a whole lot of information and analysis and detail that, in light of the time and this level of discussion that we've already been through, and if there was time and the inclination, we could throw all that out and we could have the discussion to end all discussions about this subject.
Yeah, for folks who like data, I provided you quite a bit of data on the MRGA and how much land is vacant and whether it's residentially zoned or non-residentially zoned, and then what the capacity is with our facilities, depending on whether certain upgrades are made or whether permanent expansions are made, just so you can see. The reason why our blue line is the size it is we are directed, municipalities are directed by state law to develop a growth boundary based on your ability to serve, which required us to do this land capacity analysis, all this vacant land. What does that translate into in terms of a need for water and wastewater? Can we serve it all? Well, no, we can't do the red. That's why we shrunk it to the blue. But apparently the blue needs to shift around to accommodate county priorities.
A question for.
We have to do that very same thing for our plan, which is what we're doing right now. I don't know what the end results are going to be, though.
A question for city and county staff. We talk about trying to condense that red line, maybe expand it in more areas. Looking at that map, I see development taking place all over in every corner. We just, Funkstown is looking at annexing over 100 acres of land, presumably for development. That's your southern chunk. Over in Williamsport, because you supply Williamsport with water, correct, through the city? With the permit. With the C&O Canal Park Service, who knows the boom that might take place there in the years coming. And then as Councilman Heffernan said, in the northern end around the airport and north, just recently the hotel was in the works and a trailer company is in the works. So, there's a lot of activity in all corners. If capacity is an issue, do we need another water source? Do we need more water? Is that the project we should be looking at rather than, eliminating some areas for growth? Do we need?
Some of these projects could be accommodated by a well if a well would be approved. And so that's part of the adjustments to the county water and sewer plan, because the health department looks to the county water and sewer plan for direction on where it should be publicly served. And so that's where we're having this issue now, where the city says our area is the blue line. There may be a pipe out there, but we don't have the capacity to accommodate it. But because the pipe is out there, the health department tells the property owner near the pipe, you can't have a well because of pipes there. So we're trying to help with that issue.
How many years down the road are we looking at for maybe a new well, if that's what's needed? A new water source?
By the county, I guess.
Either.
Or
Yeah, I mean, I
That's
don't
the
think there's
$64 million
anything that
question, I
precludes
think.
the county from developing a county water source to provide county-owned potable water supply, much like it did when it created the county sewer system and provided sewer to a number of customers. The fact of the matter is, and we keep using this term public, but this is not a public water supply. The water supply is owned by the city of Hagerstown, has been since its inception. It's about 12 times the size of all other water systems in the county combined, and the state, and fortunately I get to work in local government and get to see this over the last decade, but MDE has made it very clear through its directives to MDP that all local jurisdictions which own water supplies are going to be required a capacity management plan that doesn't take into account just what's developed, but also the land within the jurisdiction that has the ability for development, which means any of that space outside of the jurisdiction is sort of second in line to that. The misnomer, though, is MDE is also the same entity that has said the county will be the entity that sets the parameters of the water and sewer master plan, which to me has never made sense because most counties aren't the purveyors and owners of the water and sewer supply systems. But that's simply how it's working. I think what we're saying is we're under the directive from MDE to do something that doesn't meet the allowance that MDE provides you the directive to do, and they just they don't meet up. We can't produce it, out of what we do not have, and those parameters, like it or not, are only becoming more restrictive over time. I see it in the jurisdiction that I work for, whether it's our spring supply, our well supply, our surface water supply. Those restrictions are getting more because, in this case, we're not the only system on the Potomac. And right now, that is largely the only system that we depend on to provide water supply. In fact, we supply more customers outside of the city at this point than we do inside of the city, and we are set to spend about $12 to $15 million to secure a backup supply that we own in the Edgemont area that MDE, also the same entity, appears to be making it more than reasonably difficult for us to do. And that's simply the position we're in. I think for us, and I was part of this, back some time ago, from the annexation policy through the update to the plans, I think all we're saying is, if there are areas specifically that the county want designated as economic development areas, if it's the Hopewell Valley area and the Friendship Technology area and the airport area, then that's good. We can agree on that. But we have to then decide that some of these areas that are simply vacant space that provide possible opportunity, they need to be taken out, much to the chagrin, frankly, of folks that have that expectation and have, frankly, that political desire to want to be in. We have to say that they can't be, because those other areas, take priority because they are the economic development areas.
I think the councilman and Commissioner Kiefer have pinpointed the most prickly issues in this whole discussion, and we've had those discussions and recognized those issues at the staff level, which is why we thought it was important to elevate this discussion to the elected officials.
The difficulty for us is requests aren't stopping, and so we look at our annexation policy, and it started out with 6 exceptions. Now we're up to 10, right? We're up to 10 exceptions, and I think the last proposal was for 7-Eleven? And so we're reading the exception, and we say, we can accept this item for a major economic development opportunity, and we see the request is for a 7-Eleven that happens to be, I believe, up in the airport area, right? And so we have to weigh in our minds with this critical limitation on supply, whether that's what the county meant in defining that as your economic development area.
Commissioners, Council, can we just consummate this discussion too, that we're going to continue the discussion between us, staff level?
We'll also be talking to the state, I think it's next week, or next week or in 2 weeks, because the state is aware of this issue, and Rob and I and staff will be meeting with them to get their attention on this and see what we can get through with them.
Scott, is there anything else you'd like to introduce tonight, or is that?
No, thank you.
Unless you guys want to talk about the stadium.
Please do. You may begin. Someone said they wanted to talk about the.
We're good. I said, not unless you want to talk about the stadium.
That's up to you guys. We're here to entertain you or not entertain you. You want to take a few minutes to mention it? You're welcome.